Okay, welcome to the lighting and rendering part, which is part 3 of this tutorial series. Go check out part 1 and 2 if you haven't come up to this point yet. But basically, what we have done previously is we just finished texturing our sushi, and now we're going to add in the lights and make this look great before we render it out. So if you are following along, you should be in the shading tab. So let's go back to the layout tab and let's split our view again. So if you go to the top left of your screen and you see those little four lines pop up, that means you can drag a new window. And let's drag in a new window like this. And to close this menu on the side, let's press N and let's go into our camera view so we can see what we're rendering. So let's change our render engine to Cycles, which is going to be Blender's main render engine. The other render engines is Eevee and Workbench, but today we're going to be using Cycles, which uses more of a realistic approach when it comes to lighting. So to be able to see what we're actually seeing is if you haven't followed to this part, just make sure that you're on render properties and then render engine cycles. But if you're not seeing anything happening right now, that is because we are in viewport shading mode. And even on this side of our window, we're also in viewport shading mode. So on the left, let's change it to viewport shading. So the difference between viewport shading over here and to rendered view is that viewport shading just allows us to see our basic textures and what our the fast version of our rendered view is basically this one, and then the cycles version, which is the noisy version, that is the one that takes the most calculations, and it's because our light bounces are occurring in this render view. So to add a light in, what we can do is make sure that nothing is selected, and let's add in a new collection to our outliner by right clicking and pressing new. And let's add or change our name to lights in our collection. So with your collection selected, let's say Shift A and let's add in an area light. So this is going to act as our main light, which is going to be lighting our entire scene. So let's just drag it up to this point and let's drag it to the side, and let's make as if it's coming from the side, from a sun angle. So you can imagine this is sitting in a restaurant and the kitchen is busy lighting this from the side on the table, or whatever your imagine tells you. But basically right now our area light is only directly shining down, and that is being indicated by this straight line that is pointing towards our table. So to change this, we need to rotate our light. So let's rotate it on the x-axis by pressing R and then X and then 45, and that rotates it by 45 degrees. And then let's rotate it on the z-axis by pressing R and then Z and rotating it so that it's shining directly towards the end of this. And let's just drag it a little bit to the side, something like that. And we can see now that we've got a light source coming from the side, and that is looking great. But our light is quite dull, and we can also see that our rice is looking terrible and our sushi is looking terrible. So at this point you'll find this a lot in your workflows, that you need to chop and change your textures. Like I said earlier, that we might be changing textures as we light our scene. So we can go back to our shading viewport and we can see here we need to tick our scene light and scene world here in the viewport shading drop down. Let's just make sure that these two things are ticked so that we can see what our lighting is doing. And let's just change the bump of our seaweed over here. So right now yours should be at 1. Let's change it to about 0.6, like that. And let's change its roughness value a bit down. So originally it was at 0.5, so let's just change it a bit down so that it's got some kind of that shiny look to it. So in my reference you can see it's got a little bit shine to it, like that. And then our rice is also looking quite bumpy, so your strength would be at 1. I'm just going to change mine to 0.5, something like that. And we can even make it a little bit less, something like 0.2. That looks better. And our roughness value can be 0.14. so that we got our rice to look a little bit more, you know, ricey, so to speak. Let's go back to layout view, and we can see that our rice looks a little bit better. It's not so sharp and dark anymore. Our sushi is getting there. We haven't lit it up properly yet, so let's add in a second light. But before we add the second light, let's just change the value of the power of our area light. So with our light selected, let's go to the properties panel and go to the green icon, which is the light. And you can see that if I drag this up a little bit, you can see that we've got our area lights over here. That's the type of light that we're using. It's color, it's power, its shape, its size, and its max bounces. Max bounces, you can leave it 1024 for now. Don't have to worry about that too much, but that's how many times our light is bouncing in our scene. So our power, we can change to something a bit higher. So if I drag this up, you can see that our light gets quite high. Or if I change it to like 200 watts, it's quite bright. That's not exactly what we want. So let's change it to 50 and see what that value does. And I think that's looking fine. 50 looks like a good medium point. And let's change our color. I'm just going to move my reference a little bit to the side. Let's change our color to a very slight yellow. So there's kind of like a warmish look to it. Something like that. You can see my hex value if you want to have the exact same copy of it. But I'm just going to change this to something like that. And I think I'm quite happy with that. So looking at my reference, we're getting somewhere. So let's add in a second light. So in my viewport over here, I'm going to deselect everything, and I'm going to say Shift A. I'm going to say area light. I'm going to drag it up like this, and I'm going to drag it on the X. And this is going to act as our full light, which is just going to color in our shadows a little bit, and get rid of all the harsh shadows coming from our main key light. So with our lights positioned accordingly, let's rotate it so that it's facing directly at our sushi. So just pressing R and then rotating it, and then rotating it on the Z axis, what we can get is this result, something like this. And I'm going to change this color to be a little bit more purpley or pinkish, something like that. And you can change you can copy that hex value if you like. But basically, I'm going to also change the color of, or the power of this to about 20 watts, something like that. And yeah, that's looking great. So now you can see in our reference, we've got some purple. I'm just going to make this image a little bit bigger. We've got some purple highlights here at the back. So those are point lights that I added in. So let's make this a little bit smaller. So for our point lights, we're going to add in a light and say point. And I'm just going to drag this out. And you can see that it's showing over here in our render view. But if I drag this out like this, and I bring it a little bit more up, and let's change its color to a purpley pinkish color, something like that. And let's change its power to about 25 watts, something similar. And we can bring it a bit up, something like this. Okay, and then we can add in a second one, because we can see that we've got some highlights here in the right of our sushi bowl. So let's duplicate this light by pressing Shift D and then bring it closer in, something like that. So now we're not going to achieve the exact same result as this render, but you get the idea, and it's quite similar. So now we can see that our sushi, I'm not too happy about our seaweed. So I'm going to go back into the shading tab, and I'm just going to change the value of my seaweed. So I'm going to select my sushi roll, make sure that I'm in the seaweed section, and I can see the bump is quite harsh. So I'm going to change the roughness of my noise texture to be a bit lower, and I'm going to change the scale to be a bit smaller, something like that. And I think I'm quite happy with that value as well. If I look at it, this one is a bit finer. but I'm starting to like this version a bit more as well. And yeah, it's starting to get there. So the more you play around with your lights, and the more you play around just with your textures, and you know, getting the right balance around, you'll get to a result that you're happy with. I mean, you don't have to use the exact same values that I'm using, but you get the idea of the workflow, and that's the most important thing. So lastly, just to add in a touch to this, we want to add in our 2 flowers. Now, as a beginner artist or beginner Blender user, I'm going to be teaching you something quite advanced, but I think all Blender users should know this, is how to append an object from another blend file into your Blender scene. So taking an object from another blend file and bring it into your existing scene. So what we can do is, in the link or the description of this video, I've linked a Google Drive to the Lotus flower. So what you can do is you can go to File, you can append, and you can find the location of where that blend file is for the Lotus. And once you've found that blend file, you can select it and you can say append, and you'll be greeted with brush, collection, freestyle, etc, etc. So what we're going to do is we're going to append the collection, and we are going to append the Lotus flower, and we're going to say append. And what that's going to do is it's going to bring in this massive flower. You'll see it might lag a little bit, so we can go into normal viewport, and having our layout selection or our layout window selected, just so that we can lay this out properly, we can see that we did append our collection of our Lotus flower into our lights. So I did that by mistake, so I'm just going to bring my collection out, and I'm going to close it, and we can see that we've got 3 collections, or 4 collections. Our original one that Blender gave us by default, our Lotus flower, our sushi, and our lights, and then we've got just a camera object in the open. So let's go to our Lotus flower, and if you press on the drop down and close the middle, we can see there's an empty. So if you have this empty selected, what that does is it's taken all of our petals, all the object arts over here, and it's made it its main parent. So if I select the empty here in my object or my outliner, and I scale this empty down, we can see that it scales the flower down. So I'm just going to scale it to a reasonable size that I like, and I'm just going to drag it out, scale it down, and place it so that it is somewhat laying on our plate. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you just want to make sure that it's not clipping into our plate too much. As you can see over here, we just want to make sure that it's like sitting nicely on top. And if I double tap R, I rotate this flower freely on all axes, and I'm just going to point it towards the camera a little bit, and I'm going to bring it up like this, and I'm going to just drag it so that it works inside my camera view and it's looking all good. So I'm just going to scale that down again, bring it down, and if I take my Lotus flower collection and I say duplicate collection, that's going to make a new collection with all of its object data and basically duplicate everything in it. Instead of having to select all of it and saying Shift D, I can also just duplicate the collection. So selecting the second Lotus flower is empty. I'm just going to drag it out like this, scale it down to make it a little bit smaller, double tap R to rotate it freely, and just position this so that no clipping is really that visible, and it looks reasonably placed in our scene. So we're almost at the end of this video. One last thing is we just need to set our camera properties so that we've got some blur in the background so that it looks nice and aesthetic. And then we're just going to configure the render settings and get this ready for rendering. So let's go into our camera, and we can see here that our focal length is at 50 millimeters. I'm going to change this value to, making sure that I'm in my camera view, I'm just going to change this value to about 65. And what that does is it kind of zooms in and makes everything a little bit more flat. But now you can see that we have lost our details of our sides. So what we can do is we can just take our camera, and in our transform properties, we can just move this camera on the x-axis. But you can remember in the beginning I locked all of it. So I'm just going to unlock the location of it, and I'm going to select my camera, just move it a little bit back, go into the view, and I'm just going to make sure that my camera is placed correctly. Once again, you can use camera to view to place your camera in the right space, but I think this is looking good, so you can do that. So now we want to add in some blur for our camera. So what we can do here is we need an object to tell our camera where the blurring needs to happen. So I'm going to say Shift A, and I'm just going to add in an empty, and this is going to be our blur controller. So making sure that it doesn't pop up in your Lotus collection, just make sure that you can place it outside of your collections. You can make a separate collection for this if you like. I'm just going to place it here, and I'm just going to call this camera blur, and that's going to act as my controller for my blur. So with my camera selected, I'm just going to go into its view, and in my camera properties we can tick depth of field. So making sure our rendered view is on, we can actually just go to our material view, which is going to look a little bit better for us while we visualize the depth of field. I'm going to select depth of field, and you can see everything gets quite blurry. But if I go to my focus object here, I can type in my camera blur object, and I'm going to select that. So now it's blurring it according to this controller. So if I bring this closer, you're going to see that it blurs differently. If I bring it outwards, it's going to blur according to where the position of this object is. So I'm going to select or move this empty so that it's somewhat in the center of our sushi bowl. And I'm going to select my camera again, and I'm going to change the f-stop to about 4, and I'm going to change my blades to about 4 as well. And what that is going to do is it's going to blur the background a little bit, and if I move this around, you can see that we get a nice blur effect if we do move this around. Basically, you get the idea. If I want to just change this, I can adjust its value, its height, and its distance in my scene, and my camera, its f-stop value. So I'm going to change this f-stop value again just to check what it does. The lower the value, the more blurry it's going to get. So I'm going to go for something like 1.4 and not 4. I actually want my background to be a bit more blurry, and I think that is looking great. So with that set up, if I go into my rendered view, we can see that this is almost ready to render, but we just need to change a few values in our render properties before we start a render. If I go to render properties here, and I change some of my, depending on if you're a laptop or a desktop, and if your CPU is better than your GPU. If you do not know that, I recommend that you go look up what is your CPU and what is your GPU before you start rendering this. But just make sure that if you do have a good GPU, that you're on GPU compute. And in our sampling, we can see that our viewport sampling is set to 1024 samples. We're not going to render that much. We're going to be rendering at 256 samples for now. So in our render, you can see that it's set at 4096. Now that's going to take quite a while to render out if your computer is not strong. If you've got a great computer, great, but our samples don't need to be that high for this scene because we don't really need that much samples. So I'm going to change this to 256, and I'm going to tick denoise, and that's going to help denoise all the noise in our scene. And once we are ready and we are happy with our lighting, our textures, and the positioning of our camera and its depth of field, we can go up to the render over here, and we can say render image. And while that renders, you'll see that we get something like this pop up, and it's going to take its time to render. Okay, and then once that is finished rendering, my render took about 6 minutes to render this out on a 1060. As you can see, what I noticed in my render is my soy bowl is quite small. So what I'll do is I'll go adjust the scale of this and change it to be a little bit bigger. But essentially you are finished, and what you can do is you can save this as a image or a PNG, and you can go Photoshop it, you can go change its color properties, you can go put it in and post it on your social media. If you do post it on your social media, tag us in it. I would like to see your work. If you like the video, if you like the series, please consider subscribing and giving us a like. Really appreciate it. But I hope you enjoyed this series, and I'll see you guys next time. Cheers.